Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Okay, nice to see you all this afternoon to come out and hear what we have to say about the classical African civilization of Nubia. And I started this work about a quarter century ago of doing firsthand or primary research. And at the time, I had really no idea where it would lead. But over time, I noticed that around the country and actually around the world, in the 19 countries that I've actually traveled to, there's been one interested person after another who has been very instrumental in helping me to do the work. So over the years, the work has snowballed into really a global campaign. You have no idea how many phone calls and emails that we receive regarding this event, where people were interested in a webinar because they're not here in the Bay Area, so that they can get the first-hand, up-to-date information about classical Africa, particularly Nubia. So I want to thank you all for coming out, and I have the opportunity to share with you the fruits of my field work just last year. So I'm going to give you an overview of really why Nubia is significant, why it's important. And you know, people hear about Nubia, they talk about Nubian kings or Nubian queens, but I want to share with you the details of that. And we had a seminar some months ago on the historical significance of Kush. And when I say that, a lot of young people said, he's talking about Kush. They think we're talking about marijuana and dope smoking. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the ancient civilization of Kush. So that's what we're going to focus on today, the second of these classical African civilizations of Nubia. And so obviously we're talking about Africa. And it's important, as my colleagues has mentioned, that Egypt is one of these classical African civilizations. The correct name is actually Kemet. So that's the third oldest of these classical African civilizations. But today we focus on the second one. So I'm going to share with you why Nubia is important and what's at stake, because that's why we're really here. So the order in which these African civilizations emerged are first Kush, and then Nubia, and then Kemet. And the Greeks changed the name Kemet to Egypt. So this is a vast study. I mean, we can spend literally years and never really scratch the surface, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of archaeological sites that are up and down the Northeast African corridor in current day Sudan, current day Egypt, parts of Ethiopia. Then there are collections around the world that have artifacts in museums, institutes, libraries. So this is why I've traveled around the world. So we call these classical African civilizations because classical is more important than just saying ancient. We hear about classical what? Classical dance, classical theater, classical music, classical what else? Okay, and so what does classical mean? Because we hear the term, the standard. What else? The model, the guide, the prototype. And classical means anything that has permanent and lasting value. That's why we call these classical African civilizations. More important to call it classical and not simply ancient. And so my colleague, Professor Hodge, mentioned the Africana Studies Department. And do you know that in all of Northern California, from Sacramento to San Jose and beyond, the History 110 course on African civilizations, this is the only course that's taught as a requirement in any community college in the entire region on classical Africa. Most community colleges have no class on African civilizations. They don't have one. And the few that do, it's an optional course. So we've made it a requirement here. And the only other course of its type that is taught anywhere in this vast region is the one that I teach at Merit. And it's because I created the class. Even though I'm full-time here, I created it. So these are the only two classes that someone can really learn about this at the community college level. So anyway, this is why we call these classical African civilizations, because they reach the apex of human achievement. We're not just using terms, but this is the best of the best. It's what humanity drew from. And that these civilizations have been either dismissed, ignored, omitted, or have been detached from Africa in some way. So I want to share with you what I was doing in Sudan a year ago, and I'm going to go back to do more research, which is important. So in terms of the origins of Nubia, it emerges as a powerful kingdom about 3400 before the Common Era. And so that's about 5400 years ago that it emerged in its full state with an elaborate kingship. And we see this as a crucial development in the Northeast African corridor. And so the location of Nubia is not a country, it's an area in southern Egypt and northern Sudan, and that's where the Nubians are today. They're in that region. So that's why I go to the area. But one thing that makes Nubia crucial and important is the first clear evidence of a pharaonic state. We hear about pharaohs, but a state organized under a king. They called him a per-ah. Per-ah simply means great house. Like we hear about the White House, they said the per-ah or great house, and that was changed by the Greeks to the word pharaoh. But the first image of a per-ah, we see that emerging in the Nubian region. It's the first clear evidence. We also see clear evidence of the Medu Neter inscription. And I use the original names because, as Brother Malik mentioned, as I read the Medu Neter or so-called hieroglyphs, there's no reason really to mention the foreign names that the Greeks later called the terms, because we can read the original. And so, and also the culture of Nubians today gives us great insight about the classical Nubian civilization of the past. You look at their cultural norms, their moral ways, their ways of life, or their life ways, you can see that they come from a high level civilization. People are stunned when they see the high level development of modern day Nubians. They may not have a lot of material resources, but their character and the way they organize their culture is absolutely stunning. But that's why we go to the region to learn about Nubia, because of these things here, because they represent a firm foundation in the classical African tradition. And by the way, I have to explain these things because if we were talking about Greece or Rome, it would be unnecessary. People assume the value of Greece and Rome. Is that not correct? So, but we have to explain this because this is pretty much new information, and there's very few people in the world that have this information. So there's very few Nubiologists who specialize in the study of ancient Nubia, and there's even fewer people who know about ancient Kush, which we call Kushology. People hear about Egyptology, but what about Nubiology and even more importantly, Kushology? These are emerging fields. So you have people who have really misled the public about these cultures. And so when I was an undergraduate student, I followed the tradition and the guidelines of the great primary researcher, Dr. Chancellor Williams, who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization. He indicated one of the great stories, how did Africans go from building pyramids to living in projects and slums? He chronicles the whole story. But what makes Chancellor Williams important is he lays out step by step what younger historians should do. And so he was a pioneer, to say the least. And one of the things that caught my attention is Chancellor Williams, he put together this map of the so-called Ethiopian Empire. By the way, the word Ethiopia is a Greek word. It means black face, burnt face, or kissed by the sun. That's what Ethiopia means, because the Greeks were stunned by the skin tone, the skin color of the Africans in Northeast Africa. And, but they changed the name Kush to Ethiopia. That's where the term comes from. So when you see the Ethiopian Empire, Chancellor Williams really means the Kushite Empire. And what's interesting here is that this researcher did research among 26 countries in Africa and did research among 105 different language groups. He was a researcher's researcher. He did this work in the 1950s, and he put together a very important map, because if you notice here, he understood, Chancellor Williams did, that Nubia is the southern part of the Ethiopian or Kushite Empire, then Kemet is the northern part. So he properly understood this as a vast region where Nubia and Kemet, or so-called Egypt, that they related to the much older mother culture of Kush. And so this is what inspired me when I read The Destruction of Black Civilization, but also took a look at his map. And so here's one of the things that Chancellor Williams said. He said, I regard direct investigation in the field and in Africa as the highest importance. I was inspired by this. I've done work in many different fields, many different subjects, but one of the subjects that caught my attention was to look at Africa, because I remember when I was growing up in middle school and high school, we didn't learn anything. In fact, we didn't even learn anything in college. I didn't. And so I was stunned that I would go and matriculate at a historically black college and learn none of this. And when I asked my professor about it, she felt offended that I asked that we learn a little bit more about Africa. Anyway, notice what Chancellor Williams says. He says, so vast and untapped is the real history of the African race that I myself only scratched the surface of what is yet to be done. Some of the areas to be explored by future historians are set forth in pages which follow in this chapter. So when I read this, I didn't see it as an abstract text. I actually took his work personal. So what I did, I replaced future historians with my name, Abenu Mpim, because I thought that Dr. Williams was talking to me when he said that future historians would explore the area. That you never know where your life's mission would take you. But for me, it was really to follow in his footsteps. But notice he also mentions that there's a great tragedy that has occurred. That's the loss of the civilizations. And I didn't want to be someone who talked about it, complained about it, but didn't do anything about it. So I've been on the case for the last couple decades looking to recover the history. Let me show you how Nubia is very much misunderstood by mainstream Egyptologists, because they really don't know. For example, this is a book that people often refer to, Ancient Nubia, by David O'Connor. And this is a classic example that people are very confused. We're talking about people who are at the pinnacle of their field, and yet they don't know about, that much about classical Africa. So take a look at David O'Connor's statement. He said, Nubia and Nubians for the periods covered in this book refer only to the geographical locations, not to the ethnicity or language of the people involved. Nubia is a word of uncertain origin, uncertain for him. And he also goes on to admit that often the people or place involved is obscure to us. Who's he talking about? He's talking about mainstream. It's obscure to them. They didn't read Chancellor Williams. They didn't read Drusilla Dunjee Houston or John G. Jackson or other authors who've written about this whole area. And he also is clear that he's unclear. So he says, are the people named the entire Nubian nation or those of a sub-region or even a small village? We don't know. Is the place all Nubia, part of it, or a single site? And which are located in which place? These questions can puzzle scholars. He means mainstream scholars. He's not talking about Chancellor Williams, because they don't read people outside of the mainstream. So let me help O'Connor out and clarify some of these things today. In fact, you might find this map online somewhere, just to give you an idea that this map has little to do with the historical location of Nubia. I mean, yes, it is in Northeast Africa. You can see the smaller map here, but this whole area has never been all of Nubia. Nubia is in the area where you can see Aswan, so southern Egypt and northern Sudan. Nubia never went further south than this area here. But because the mainstream writers and Egyptologists don't know, they just use a generic term in order to cover up for the fact that they don't know. And they make up maps that really have little to do with facts. And then they take this further, the mainstream. I'm just showing you this in order to indicate the context of the work that I've done to clarify these questions that a lot of the people don't know. Now here you have a National Geographic, February 2008, the Black Pharaohs. That's redundant. Why do you call them the Black Pharaohs? That's like saying the wet rain. We know by nature the rain is wet. That's like somebody talking about the Sahara Desert. Why would you repeat? What does Sahara mean in Arabic? It means desert. So why is somebody repeating Black Pharaohs? No one talks about the white emperors of Rome. Have you ever heard that term? No, it's assumed, is it not? So these people have tried to make it seem like only some of the pharaohs were black, and that's the 25th dynasty in the late age. But let me introduce you to Robert Moorcock. This is someone that I had a chance to spend some time with when I lived in London in 1989 and 90. Robert Moorcock, he popularized the term the Black Pharaohs. He may not have coined it, but he certainly popularized it with his book. And then he makes a cardinal mistake. He says Egypt's Nubian rulers. This is an image of the great Taharqa. Taharqa is the greatest builder among the people of Kush. Everywhere you look in the Nile Valley, Taharqa is building pyramids, building elaborate temples, building great structures that confound the world. When